Hi, and in today's vlog, what I'd like to talk about are the types of raiding guild. There are three main types of raiding guild, and I want to also discuss what sort of features each of them has. It might actually give you some ideas for way in which your own guild could become more competitive by doing some of these things that actually you'd maybe not have considered. Now, when it comes to the three types of guild, first of all, we should define a few terms. When you look anywhere where guilds describe what sort of guild they are, usually they'll try and describe themselves to prospective new members when they're trying to get new recruits, so by WoW Progress or any of the forums, and they'll describe themselves as either hardcore, semi-hardcore, or casual. And of course, there is no set definition for each of these within the World of Warcraft raiding community. And, you know, you often get into arguments. I mean, I might say what my definitions of these are, and some people say, well, no, I don't agree with that, which is fine. I am going to define them for the purpose of this video because I get into enough arguments sometimes on forums when I will use a term and people say, oh, no, it doesn't mean that. It's like, you can't really argue about a definition of a word. It's in the dictionary. And the same sort of applies here, but it's quite vague. Like hardcore, for example. If you look up hardcore in the dictionary, it basically says the most committed. And that's why I ascribe to it. Now, my definitions would be that a hardcore guild, there are lots of things guilds can do to become more competitive. Ultimately, what do raiding guilds want to do? They want to kill bosses. Many of those raiding guilds want to kill it in a competitive time. At the very least, they'll want to get the cutting edge achievement, and for some guilds, even that isn't enough. They want, you know, much higher progress, high ranks, maybe even world first. So what we'd have to say is, what I would say is that a hardcore guild is a guild that does everything. If there's something you can do to make yourself more competitive, they do it. They find a way to do it. A casual guild on the other end of the scale is someone who's much more relaxed about it. These guys want to kill bosses, sure. They're not that bothered about the progress. They certainly don't want to upset anyone or overly stress anyone over it. It's just like, we'll just all do our best, guys, and we'll see what happens. And then semi-hardcore obviously is going to be somewhere in the middle. Whereabouts in the middle do we place them? That is the one that is most open for definition. But I'm going to suggest it's a guild that does what it can to be competitive, but it also doesn't want to force people in that guild to do anything that is not considered reasonable. So now we've got those out of the way, what are some of the things that guilds can do to make themselves more competitive? Well, the first one, when you sort of think about it, is time. That's the first thing that comes to people's heads when they're thinking about hardcore guilds or casual guilds. How much time do you guys spend raiding? And you'll look on WoW Progress if you're looking for a new guild or something like that, and there'll be some guilds that like weekend guilds that do 2 days. They might even do 1 day. And there'll be some who do 3, like my guild, or 4 or 5, and some way up to 7. And some of them will do daytime and nighttime raiding, and some of them will just do the nighttime. But lots and lots of time on it, because it means lots and lots of pulls. People make mistakes on fights. It's a way of letting everyone experience the tactics. Hopefully they learn from them. If people learn after making mistakes a very small number of times, then hopefully the boss goes down. But there's also, in Legion especially, time outside the raids. And it's a huge contrast with Warlords of Draenor. I suppose there always was. At the start of an expansion, there's always a lot of time spent outside of raids as well, because you're gearing up, and the way to get gear is not in raids. For anyone, it's in dungeons and other content like that. But in Legion, even when the raids have come out and raid gear is what you're going to obtain, there's still good gear, potentially even better gear, from dungeons. And at the very least, you're going to want your artifact power from various other parts of content to make sure that your artifact is at max level, which of course it now is for any sort of hardcore or semi-hardcore raider. But there was a time when it wasn't, and that time will come again in 7.2, and yet again people are going to be doing stuff outside of raids to farm that. Now, there will be some guilds who just say, look, we're going to raid 3 nights a week or 4 nights a week or even 5 nights a week, whatever it is, but your artifact power can be whatever it is, you just do what you can. And there'll be other guilds that say, no, look, we want to make sure that you've got this artifact power by this time, because, do you know what, the bosses are tuned around that. We need to make sure that we have that. Another thing guilds can do are split runs. Now, if you don't know what split runs are, this is the idea that your players have at least one alt, and in the very serious guilds, certainly the hardcore guilds, you will have multiple alts. Multiple characters that are all capable of raiding at the highest level, and you know how to play them well, they're geared well, they've got their artifact power up, all the rest of it. And the idea is, let's say you just have one alt. Let's say this is a semi-hardcore approach, so each player has two characters. They have their main character, which is what's going to do the progress, but they also have an alt that's pretty good, well geared as well, and they know how to play it reasonably well. So the raid comes out for the first week. Mythic isn't available, it's just normal and heroic. So what you do is you split the raid into two. You have half of that raid are mains, and half of it are alts. And you run through heroic mode, and normal mode later in the week as well. So that all the loot that drops, you're distributing it across only half the raid, because only half the raid are mains. And then you do it in another raid, and then the other mains are in that raid, and they get that as well. So it's a way of doing heroic and normal twice in the week to get twice as much gear, which you can then funnel into your raiders. And you can well see why more hardcore guilds will want even more outs, because they could get to a situation where there's only 5 mains in each raid, and they're doing 6 raids or something like that. So they're getting 6 times as much gear as people who don't do split runs, such as my guild, who will only get one lot of that gear. It means that within the first week, you can potentially have everyone with the 4-set bonus. There's still a little bit of RNG, of course, but you can have most people with the 4-set bonus. You'd certainly have more of the good trinkets there, as well as other pieces of gear, upgrades, and so on. You will simply have better gear, and better gear helps you push phases on bosses more quickly. And then when it comes to Mythic, of course, you don't dilute your Mythic raid guild in that way. Until you've completed it, in which case you do it again to build up the alts, because that's what you'll do as once you've finished a tier, you will then split the Mythic raids to funnel gear into those alts, so that when the next tier comes out, those alts are also very well geared for that as well. The next thing some guilds may do is PTR testing. So at the moment, for example, there are some bosses on the PTR for Tomb of Sargeras, the next tier that's coming up, so people can get in and test them out. Now, this isn't early access to them as such. The bosses will be bugged, and they may even change their abilities. The whole purpose of this testing is largely so that Blizzard can check that it isn't actually bugged. They're more concerned with bugs than like the philosophy of the fight or anything like that. But certainly mechanics can change. Mechanics can be removed. They can be made simpler, usually simpler than more difficult. Things can be tuned up or down. So it's not like if you've done the PTR testing, you will instantly know what to do when you do it for real. But you'll have got used to a few ideas. When you first start on a boss, even if you've watched videos of other people doing it and you've read tactics, you still have to experience it for the first time, because you can read about how much damage an ability does. But until you've experienced it, you don't really know whether, is this the sort of ability I can take to do some more damage, or do I really need to move out of it because it's too much for the healers? You get a feel for the environment, you get a feel for how much movement's required, you get a feel for like the range on hitboxes of the bosses and other mechanics as well. You just get a feel for the overall thing, so that even if Blizzard do tune things up or down, or even remove mechanics or change mechanics, you've still got that grounding in the fight. It's still a familiar place to you when you first go in. Unlike the people who don't do PTR testing, which is of course the vast majority of guilds, mine included, where you're going in for the first time and you've got to experience all this for the first time and everything, and you will inevitably take a little bit longer because of it. And that brings me on to the next point, because another thing that guilds will ideally do is engage in discussions before they ever get to the boss. Before you ever get to progressing on a boss, it'll have already been discussed in your guild how to approach it, what the best ways are, because it's one thing to look at a video of someone else killing it and go, oh, we'll just do that then. The problem is your guild similar to theirs? Maybe their tactics centered around a very, very good player doing something very clever with a mechanic that meant other people didn't have to deal with it. Well, do you have such a person in your raid? You may not, in which case you're going to struggle trying to ape that one. You in the first instance, ideally need to find someone who's got a similar roster to you. I mean, even if, just to take as a simple example, if they've got a very different healer composition to yours, then they won't be able to manage the healing cooldowns in quite the same way, because different healers have different types of cooldowns, which are of varying usefulness in different situations. So it might be impossible for you to cope with the healing in the same way that they do. And the other thing is that if you just have one or two people trying to work out the tactics for it, the danger there is they might not be aware that a particular class or player brings something to the table that would actually be really useful. Or we might be expecting too much of someone because we overestimate how much someone could do. Whereas if more people discuss it, then people can come up with ideas, it can be refined, and then by the time you actually get to that boss, it's all been discussed in detail. And I'm not saying you wouldn't adapt it whilst you're progressing on the boss, but you have a good working plan for when you do go on it and you don't waste a lot of time with something that was never going to work from the start. Now, the other thing also sort of follows on from Alt, really, is having multiple characters, but this time not for doing split runs, although they'll do that as well, but for swapping in and out of fights as necessary. So it might be that you play one particular class which is strong on some of the fights, but then let's say it's not so strong on some others, but you've got another character that's strong on those ones as well, so it's complementary. So maybe you've got a character that's really good at AoE and cleave, but you've got another one that's really beasting it in single target. So it might well be in some hardcore guilds that you use one character for some progress on some bosses and another character. It's not like main and alt, it's actually two mains effectively, which get swapped in and out as necessary, and you have to keep up with the gear and artifact level on both of them as if they were both your main. Another one is balanced roster, or what I mean by that is being able to have everything you could possibly want. So this means having all the specs as well as including of tanks. And in reality, of course, a semi-hardcore and certainly not a casual guild would be able to have this, because of course you can't have like 6 tank players in your guild. So what we'd realistically be talking about here are either the 2 main tanks, each having 3 tank characters to cover all the classes, or that you have multiple DPS of those other classes that can also tank very well and keep up with their tank level artifact and gear. Equally, it could mean that you've got people who, if they can't swap between the different roles, that you have different players to be able to accompany them. Now, here's where you've got to tread a fine line if you're sort of in the more semi-hardcore guild. You don't, on the one hand, want to come up to a fight where a particular class has something that makes it very, very simple. Take Mythic Tichondrius, for example. One key part of that fight, it's a very simple fight in many ways, but one key part is the bat phase. Now, if you can keep the bats grouped together well, then the people who are good at AoE will be able to beast them down extremely quickly. And there's a lot of classes that can do that. But if they're more spread out, then almost no one can kill them very quickly. This is a bit of a problem. But enter the monk. So if you've got a Windwalker or a Brewmaster monk, they can place their statue down and it will taunt them all like a good one, and you'll have the bats grouped up perfectly. Now, let's take a situation where you don't have a Brewmaster or a Windwalker. Then you're missing out on that and you're making it a bit more difficult. Of course, you'll still be able to do it. There's still other ways to group them up. You know, hunters, misdirecting to tank and things like that. It's just not quite as effective. So you lose a little bit of an edge by not having those classes represented. Whereas in a roster where you do, then of course, no matter what fight comes up, if there's a particular class or spec that has something that just makes it a bit easier, if not break it completely, then you're good to go. The danger is, of course, that if you haven't just got a small number of players that have multiple specs and classes, that it means you're going to end up with a very large roster. Danger with a very large roster is either you're swapping people in and out all the time, so, you know, no one's getting very much progress there, or you're dividing gear amongst too many people and diluting the pool that's in your progress rate, especially for Mythic. We're talking about Mythic point of view. In Heroic, of course, you can have a much larger field. And then that comes to high attendance as well. In some guilds, it's a case of like, you know, turn up when you can. In other guilds, there's a minimum attendance, which is usually very high, usually at least 90%. The reason for that, of course, is that a roster that is stable will progress much faster than one that is not. You don't want to be progressing on a boss with a group of players and doing really well, then the next night 3 of them aren't there, so you've got to bring 3 new people in who might not do as well, and they're also behind. You get that awkward situation where you've wiped on a boss 100 times to the first phase or something, a very tough boss, let's say, and you've got to the point where sort of people have sort of got it now, they're ready to push on further into the fight, and then some people aren't there, so you have to bring some new players in. Well, those new players haven't experienced it. So what happens is you end up with a situation where some of those new players are falling to those mechanics because they haven't experienced them 100 times like the others have. And then the others are really annoyed because they're ready to push through now, and some people are wiping to what in their mind has been done and dusted. But of course it hasn't for them. So you end up with a huge mess. What you ideally want is in a roster, you sort of have what I call the core raid team and then the additional raid team. The core raid team are the people that you will take for progress on every fight. And the larger the proportion of that core raid team, the better. Because these are guys who are used to progressing day in, day out with each other. They've got good communication between each other. They recognise each other's voice on voice comms and so on. And you'll get much faster progress. They're not likely to say anything to upset other people because they know each other really well. And then you have a small number of additionals you may have to rotate because, let's face it, not everyone can be there 100% of the time. But you want those to be as few as possible. And you don't want those changing ideally during the progress on the same boss as well. So the only way to sort of ensure that is likely to be the case is to expect high attendance. Now, another one is loot distribution. Loot distribution has changed over the years in terms of what is most common. It started off DKP was very popular. The idea of DKP is every time you were available for a raid or in a raid, different guilds did it different ways, you acquired points. DKP, Dragon Kill Points. I believe it came from EverQuest rather than World of Warcraft, but don't quote me on that, I don't know. And then the idea is when loot drops, you bid a certain amount of DKP. There's two main ways of doing it. You could either, everyone who wanted it would just say they wanted, and whoever had the most DKP got it, and they would have their DKP tally deducted according to the cost of the item. Other people might have a bidding process, which was a bit of an advantage in that the people who really wanted it the most were more likely to bid the most. So it was supposedly going to people who could use it more. That's fallen out of favour in favour of Loot Council now. The benefit of Loot Council is you can give it to where it's going to do the most good. Like if you get a really good item drop, do you really want it going to someone who's going to be on the bench for the next boss? No. You want it in the raid for your progress. So it allows you to load up gear where it's going to do the most good. So you might look at an item and it might be a bigger upgrade for player A than player B. But player B does 50% extra damage. So even though percentage-wise it's not as big an upgrade for them, in terms of the raw DPS you're going to get out of it, it might still be better going to that second player. It also means that if you're in a situation where, let's say your healers are actually able to keep up with the healing, maybe they don't need so much gear, maybe that gear goes to a caster instead, because you can never have enough DPS. Same with tanks, it allows you to give them just enough to be able to cope, and then load the rest up on DPS, because higher DPS will push through any phase more quickly. Consumable use is a big one. In some guilds, you will expect people to use the full range of consumables. That will, of course, include flasks. That's been the case for many years now. The best pots, we've got a slightly sticky situation at the moment where there are very expensive pots that were there from the start of Legion, and then there's the prolonged power pots, which have come in later. And for some people, the prolonged power pots are better. For some people, it depends on the situation. So prolonged power pots will tend to be better in an AoE situation for a lot of people than single target, but in a single target situation. So some players will be using prolonged power pots, which are a tenth the price of the more expensive ones in many cases, and some people have to use the more expensive ones. In addition, you'll be using the most expensive food buffs, and potentially runes, augment runes as well, which are not cheap unless you're running LFR on multiple characters. And in some guilds, the use of these will vary. Most guilds nowadays will expect people to have flasks and the good potions. Some casual mons may just expect them to have flasks and potions for tougher DPS checks and not so much for other stuff. Some will expect you to use augment runes quite a lot on progress. Some will only insist on it when you're failing to meet a tight DPS check. Minimum gear requirements. This is particularly important at the start before the first raid of an expansion opens up, because the only place you can get it is from dungeons, and some people might want to just do the bare minimum and then hope to be shoveled loot when the raids open, but in reality those bosses will never die unless people's gear is up to a certain standard. So you usually set a minimum item level standard for those people. And in Legion, of course, we've had the extra thing of artifact power, so there's minimum levels. Quite a lot of semi-hardcore guilds would have expected that when Mythic Nighthold began, that people were round about 54 artifact level. or if not, within the first few weeks of it opening. Whereas many casual guilds, they may still not be 54 now. That might not be such a big deal. It's a case of, well, do what you can, and we'll just see how well we do, how far we get. Hardcore guilds, of course, will have expected people to be 54 across multiple specs, any spec they might be expected to play, and on any character they might be expected to play. So again, coming back to that time, not just spent in raids, but also spent outside of raids. Logs analysis. This is another thing you can do to make yourself more competitive. So sometimes even in the middle of a raid, but certainly between raids, you're looking at logs to see what went wrong if no one's really clear about it, or see where DPS is. Could some people maybe focus more on if there's particular priority ads not dying quickly enough? Well, who's doing the damage on them? Is there anyone who could do more damage? Maybe if they switch priorities. And micromanaging the raid, because it's not, it's many, many years since it was the case that all DPS will just focus on the same target. Now we can have a situation where at any point in a fight, you might have some DPS whose priority target is Monster A, and some other DPS whose priority target is Monster B, and so on. And it's a case of managing the DPS on those so that things die in time. But, sometimes if you would be killing something too quickly, then that's a much lower priority ad. Maybe you funnel more DPS in the boss, for example. And use of logs allows you to see this. It also allows you to see the reasons for death so that we can try and eliminate those. Because when you've got people dying over and over again, you want to eliminate that. And the first step to eliminating it is to actually know what's causing it, and then to discuss ways in which that can be improved. In fact, when it comes to logs, there's far too many guilds that just use it as fancy damage meters and just look at the overall damage done, which of course is pointless because there's any number of ways to cheese that. And what you want to do is look at the damage done to particular ads at particular points in the fight, because at some points of the fight it's more important than others. Swapping out during progress is another one. Again, a lot of guilds at the more casual end are unlikely to do this. So let's say you've got a situation where one person is consistently failing at a mechanic, and it could be any number of people, even good players can have something that just, there's a bit of a block in their brain, they're just not getting it quickly enough. And to progress more quickly, what you need to do in that situation is say, well, at the moment this isn't going well, we need to try someone else off the bench, they might be better. Now, it might well be you bring someone off the bench, they're actually not as good, you might need to try it with someone else. But again, for faster competitiveness, you need to be able to identify, this person's had enough tries at this and they're still getting it wrong, we need to get someone else in before we just go on too far. And that will help your competitiveness. But with some guilds, they will just not like to do that. It's like, well, we want this person to be in the raid. And it can apply just as much to heroic. Because remember, when you remove someone from heroic, it's not necessarily replacing them, but the overall boss's health goes down. So sometimes when you've got someone who's just not pulling their weight at all, you make the boss easier by removing someone from it, just so that you can get over that line. Because all that, the health of everything just comes down. It makes it easy for everyone else. Another thing is having low downtime during raids. Ideally, raids should just be pull, wipe, get up quickly, and then go again. Now, sometimes you can have long periods of time between pulls. It may be that that you're slow to do your wipe recovery. If everyone's running back when actually you could have soulstoned someone to get a healer up to res everyone there and then. Sometimes it might be that people come back and then they're just coming back and not doing anything. Whereas what you should ideally do, as soon as you're back or as soon as you're resed, first thing I do, check my flask. If I need to reflask, if it's less than like quarter of an hour, I reflask. Eat my food so that I'm buffed and ready to go. Some people don't. Some people are still not eating until the ready check's done, and then it's like, well, you now need to eat. Sometimes there's discussion going on. So sometimes people are talking about stuff that maybe needs to be left till later, or maybe it does need to be discussed there and then. But the more time you spend discussing things or waiting for people to get ready because they're not ready, or waiting for people who've just quickly gone AFK in your raid, you maybe turned like what was a 4-hour raid into 2.5 hours or even less of effective raiding. So it stands to reason. It's all right talking about how much time you spend raiding, but how much of it is effective? It's a bit like watching a sports game, isn't it? The actual time that it's supposed to take might be 80 minutes or 90 minutes or so, but how long does it actually take? Sometimes it can take much more than that because of the downtime between plays. And finally, I would say, and this isn't exhaustive, there may be other things that people would suggest, is actually questioning your tactics. When you're doing something and it's not going according to plan, you have to look at it and you have to think to yourself, okay, so Is this because the players just haven't got it yet? Or is there another way of doing it that maybe we should try out because maybe it'll be easier for us? Because you don't want to get fixated on something and then not consider potential options. Give you a case in point. We, at the moment, are progressing on Botanist. It's a bit of a disappointment to be able to say that because we should have really killed it. But we spent Thursday night on Botanist doing it a particular way. And the problem we have is that people are dying in phase 2. Now, the particular strategy we're using relies on us having battle reses for the final phase. But we're not, because I think maybe we've had a couple of pulls where that's been the case. But you need to get consistently into... If we got consistently into phase 3 with those 2 battle reses, we would have killed it by now. But we're not. So people are dying, usually in phase 2. So then what you need to think of in that situation is, okay, well, we could just keep going and just wait for people to stop dying. But we've already had a full night on it and people were still dying. Is there, just because this looked on paper like the best strategy, is there another way of doing it that takes account of the special nature of our guild that might not be the most popular tactic, but might suit us better? And you have to sort of sometimes just decide, even though you've spent a long time on a tactic, maybe it's time to cut loose and try something else. And if it doesn't work, go back. Okay, when you have changed tack, again, don't commit yourself to that either. Just give it enough time. Don't just try it a couple of times and go, oh no, it hasn't worked after all. You have to give it a proper amount of time. But again, always evaluate your tactics. Always decide if there's another way to do it. Analyze what's actually going wrong and say, well, can we do something different? Can we do something that means that that thing won't go wrong, or that if it does go wrong, it's actually not as big a deal as with the other tactic? Constantly re-ask yourself. And it doesn't end when you've killed the boss as well. I have been in guilds where they've killed a boss and then they've come to farm it and they keep wiping on farm for like several weeks. And sometimes you just think to yourself, just because we killed the boss doing it that way doesn't mean it was the best way. Even when you're farming it, still keep trying to think of better ways to do it to maximize your chance, because even when you've got a boss on farm, you're still progressing in that tier, and the more time you can save by not wiping on farm bosses, the more time you've got for that progress as well. All the more important for guilds that don't raid as many nights as others as well. So anyway, those are the things that I think guilds do to be competitive. And as I say, going back to the original point, what you would effectively expect in these situations is that hardcore guilds will basically do all of those things and potentially more as well. Casual guilds will only do the things that their raiders are willing to do, and they won't really put a lot of stress on raiders to do those things. And semi-hardcore guilds will have their rules. They will say, okay, these things we're going to do because we need to be competitive. But at the same time, the unique nature of our guild means that we don't expect people to do these other things as well. So you're cherry picking. You're taking some things that you say, look, this is what we do. This is our guild, but the others are not. So anyway, did you agree my things there? Have anyone got any comments? Anyone found anything that I've discussed there that they've thought about, well, maybe we could do that in our guild. It actually wouldn't be too big a deal. And maybe some of the raiders would actually be up for that. Let me know in the comments below as usual. I hope you found it interesting. As always, if you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe and share. And until next time, I'll see you later.